Hey, how's it going? This is McCoy Buck. If you've been following along with the previous tutorials, this character is available for download. The link is in the description. So far, we've gone over how to add bones, align them with joints, and make the rig work the best we can. However, we still have distortions that we need to fix, and I'm going to show you how to fix these issues with smart bones. Now, this tutorial is going to be a lot more in-depth than my other tutorials. I've done a lot of one-on-one with new users to Moho, and I have seen a common issue with smart bones that I address in this tutorial. I will show you the wrong way that I see frequently and the right way to fix smart bones. So hopefully this will be helpful. As always, the timestamps will be in the description, so if you want to go to a specific topic, that will make it a bit easier. Let's go ahead and get started. So what smart bones do, if you're not familiar with them, is they're basically going to give us the ability to fix these distortions. So I want you to get really familiar with your rig. So again, using the Manipulate Bones tool on the main bone layer, go ahead and move all of the bones that create this distortion. The leg doesn't create any distortion, nor do the upper arms, but the lower arm does and the lower legs do. So now we can see perfectly all of the distortions that are happening with this rig. So to create a smart bone, let's start with one of these distortions. So let's start with this front arm here. So using B on the keyboard to use my select bone tool, that's here in the bone tool menu, I'm gonna select the front lower arm. You can see when I select the arm, I have this label up here, B5. This is the name of this bone. Now Moho auto names the bones for you, but if you wanted to, you could label this forearm front, and you can go through and label all the bones if you find that helpful, because what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a list of all of these smart bones, so all the bones that we're going to be manipulating. But for me, I like to keep it simple, so I just leave it just how the name was. So in this case, it's B5. Now, if you don't see this actions panel, what you need to do is you need to go to Window and select Actions. And for you, it might pop up in a separate window. But what we want to do is we want to dock it in the Styles panel because it's going to keep things a little bit more organized. So then go to Window, go to Docking, and then go ahead and dock that inside of your Styles panel. So if you don't see it, it's going to be right next to your Style in the other tab. Okay, so to create a smart bone action, you need to be on the bone group layer. If you select that bone while you're on any regular layer, it's just going to create a smart action. So there's a difference between the smart bone action and a smart action. And smart actions, or just actions, they're more common for animation. So make sure that the bone group layer is selected, the bone is selected, and then go up here to this icon right here, and this is how you create a new action. When you go to click on new action, it's gonna say, okay, do you wanna name this B5? And in this case, you always want your smart bone actions to be the exact same label of your bone. So if you change the label of that bone here to forearm, it needs to say forearm here in order for smart bones to work. So in this case, both of our bone names, they match. I'm gonna hit okay. And now you'll know if you successfully created a smart bone because your timeline is going to turn blue. So the default is this gray color here, or whatever your background color is for your timeline. But when you double click and you select the smart bone, it's going to give you this blue timeline. And you'll also know if you did it properly because the bone will be red and bold. So automatically, it's now going to put your time cursor on frame 1. Now this is where it gets a little tricky, especially if you're not too familiar with animation. So I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. But with your timeline, go ahead and zoom into it by selecting this icon right here to zoom in. This one right next to it is to zoom out. So let's go ahead and let's zoom in all the way. So just click that till it's all the way zoomed in. And we're gonna use the same transform bone tool that we use when we are moving around our bone. But because we're on frame 1, anything past frame 0 is animation. So we're animating right now. So because we're on frame 1, when we go to move this bone, it's actually going to move the artwork with it. So frame 0 for the transform bone tool is what we were doing to align our bones, but frame 1 using the transform bone tool is going to animate our bones. And you can see here, when I moved that bone up, it created these dots down here. And these dots are keyframes. And more specifically, it's a smooth keyframe. So one of the things I want you to check is to make sure your settings are the same as mine. Ideally, you want to create smart bones using linear keyframe interpolations, but just to keep this simple, I'm gonna leave it at smooth. So right here, you want this default to be set to smooth. And if it, for whatever reason, doesn't match my keyframes, just go ahead and left click and drag, selecting both of those keyframes, right click, and then select smooth from this option here. So as long as you have this set to smooth, any keyframes you create here on out will also be set to smooth. The other thing that I want you to make sure that you have unchecked is relative keyframing and auto freeze keys. It doesn't really affect the rig too much right now with smart bones, but when we go to add target bones and create body turns and different things like that, having the auto freeze keys can really give you trouble because it's going to create a keyframe for all of your bones and not just the one bone that you're selecting. So go ahead and leave that checked off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move that bone back to its original position. So with the transform bone tool selected, if you come up here to the angle, this is the value of the movement that we just created. If you go ahead and you hit reset, it's going to reset it back to the default angle of the rig. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to rotate this by increments. So if you hold down shift, it's going to rotate it by, I think it's 30 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate it 3 times by 3 increments till the arm is reaching the head. And I can go more extreme, but basically what you want to do when you're setting up your smart bones is you want to make it realistic. So for example, if I was trying to create a bend for the leg, it doesn't make sense to have the leg way up here, right? Because that's not really possible as far as bends. Now for super flexible people, sure. But as far as the leg itself, it's going to be hitting the other parts of the tissue and the muscle of the leg, and it's not going to bend up perfectly. So just keep that in mind too. You only want to create the smart bone, and just for rigs in general, you only want to do as much work as the animation needs. So that's why it's really good to have your animation planned out before you even start rigging. But going back to the smart bone itself, now with that bone rotated so that we have that distortion, because that's the only bone that's creating that distortion, I'm now going to go to the bone layer. And remember that quick select option that I showed you earlier for the keyboard shortcut? Alt right click. That's going to quickly put us right into that arm front layer there. Now what I want to do is I want to move the point, and it's kind of hidden by this bone right now, but I want to move the point of that arm so it fixes that deformation. So now we're in a new set of tools. We're in our drawing tools. So if you come over here to your drawing panel and you select the transform points tool, that's the tool that we're going to be using to move these points of the arm. So if you go ahead and select the transform points tool and select that point and you drag that out, you can now see that we're getting pretty close to the original volume of that arm. Now I don't have it perfect, and that's because I don't really have a good reference as to what it was. I can go back to frame 0 and snap that back and forth to kind of get an idea of what the volume of that arm was. But something else that I can do is I can turn on onion skins. Onion skins is used a lot in animation. So again, I don't want to make it too confusing. So it gives me the ability to see before and after the keyframe that I'm currently at. And again, it's really helpful when it comes to animation. But in this case, it's going to be really helpful to know what the arm looked like so I can match the volume of that arm bend. So with the onion skin selected, so again, it's this icon right here, go to the onion skin settings, because I have some settings that I find ideal that might be helpful for you. So there's an option for outlines only. You can select that. However, I like to keep a fill for my onion skin. It also gives you an option for colored fills. You can also toggle that on and off. I don't mind leaving it as is. However, relative frames, I don't want that on. Selected layer only, I want that on. And draw behind, sometimes I find it easier to have the onion skin in front rather than behind my artwork. So I like to leave that unchecked. And then once that's done, to lay down your onion skin, you're just going to click on a frame underneath of these numbers right here. So in this area, you can see that I'm creating these different onion skins. And to remove them, if you put them in the wrong spot, you just left click them again to remove. If you have multiple onion skins, you can actually go to the onion skin settings there, and you can select clear all markers. And what those were markers for the onion skin to mark where they go. So we're on frame 1 currently, and we want to create an onion skin for frame 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put an onion skin right there under frame 0. So now we have a perfect reference as to the volume of that arm and also the length. Because sometimes what happens when you rotate your bones, depending on the bone strength, is they can also distort the length of your arm. Okay, so that's where I think this was a little bit more intermediate because this was kind of a lot to explain. So if there's something that doesn't quite make sense, be sure to let me know in the comments so I can make a video separately to focus again more on onion skins or smart bones or whatever it may be that you're still struggling with. All right, so now with that point, using the transform points tool, I now know that I need to drag it up just a little bit more. Now, smart bones can use transform points, but they can also use the curvature tool. So the curvature tool is this one right here. I want to get rid of this curve right here. So to do that, I'm going to select that point. I'm going to left click and drag to the left. And you can see it's going to reduce the curvature for that arm. And this, you don't have to make it exact science. You want to make it approximately what the arm shape originally was. I don't want you to go too overboard with this because you can get really caught up in the weeds when it comes to smart bones. So I'm just gonna hit T on the keyboard. I'm gonna just drag out this bone. I'm gonna reduce the scale, the curvature a little bit on it. I'm gonna pull this arm bone just back a little bit there. And I think that looks pretty good. So now we have the arm going up into this position. So we fixed, at least in this position, we fixed the points so that when we rotate this arm into this position, we shouldn't have any distortion. However, we still will have distortion, and that's the part I want to show you next because I can't really explain it at the moment. So once you're done with that, once you have that looking good as far as how you want it, double click on the main line once again. And because we can use the manipulate bones tool on the layer, that's fine to stay on this layer. So we'll just stay there. And again, the manipulate bones tool is Z on the keyboard. Or if you're using the tools right here, it's going to be this one right here when on a vector layer. Now I'm going to hold down Alt to rotate just that bone. And now you'll see that that distortion has basically gone away. And actually that doesn't look too bad. But however, you can see it comes to a point right here in the middle of the arm where the arm gets a little bit thicker. The volume of this forearm is bigger than what it was originally when it's straight. Now to fix that, what we need is we need additional keyframes and additional adjustments to that smart bone. However, if you go back to your smart bone, double click on the B5 in your actions panel, we're now back in the smart bone because we can see that the smart bone is highlighted and the timeline is blue. You can see because we only have 2 frames, we can't actually adjust that in-between position of when his arm was about halfway. So we need to add a frame. So in order to do that, I'm going to move my keyframes over 1 frame. So select the keyframes for this position and move them over 1 frame. Now you can see on frame 1, that distortion is back. But now we need to go back to the main bone layer, and we also need to move the rotation animation of this bone back 1 keyframe to match. So now we have the beginning position, the in-between position when his arm is a little bit bigger in volume, and then we have the end. So go back to the front arm layer and go ahead and select one of the points there to fix the volume of that arm. So I'm just gonna select this point here. I'm just gonna move that right about there. I'm gonna add a little bit of curvature there so that that volume kind of matches the same there. It's a little bit bigger down here on the bottom, but that's okay. You can adjust that with your curvature tool as well. If you hold down Alt and you select one of these handles, it'll move just the curvature for that side of the vertex or the point. And if you can't see these handles, it might be because you're using an older version of Moho. So if you don't have those handles, that's fine as well. You can do your best you can to just kind of eyeball it as far as that volume. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, you don't want to go too overboard with smart bones. You just want to fix those obvious distortions in your artwork. Okay, so now we have this default arm position, the halfway arm position, and the fully extreme all the way in arm position that had the worst distortion. So if I go back to my main line, and now I use my manipulate bones tool. For some reason, the keyboard shortcut's not working. So I'm gonna select the tool itself. Now when I hold down Alt and I go to rotate just that bone, now you might be seeing some pretty weird animation going on. If someone's already familiar with smart bones, they might know why this is happening. We're only using 3 frames to fix this distortion. And that's not enough, as you can see there. That's why it's popping. So I hope this part makes sense because I was really thinking of how I could best explain this, and I wanted to show you the wrong way to do it first and then show you the right way. So hopefully this helps explain why I would do it the right way to begin with. So double click on your B5 smart bone once again. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to create more frames, but we don't have to lay down a keyframe every time. We can actually just drag out these keyframes further out so that the smart bone works properly. It has more than just the 2 frames and it pops from frame to frame. We'll give it more frames. So think of like a video game. If it's running at 15 frames per second, you know that video game is going to be super choppy. Whereas standard nowadays is basically 60 frames per second for those super smooth, buttery frame rates, if you're familiar with video games. So we need to make that rotation buttery smooth by adding more frames. But a quicker way to do that, rather than going back between the transform bone tool and the vector layers, because that could get old pretty quick, we're going to use a Moho feature. I don't know if Anime Studio has this. So if it doesn't, I'm sorry, you'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. But if you right-click in this top layer panel right here, and you select timeline, I think it's timeline visibility. Yeah, if you select timeline visibility and have that checked, you have this little stopwatch icon, and this can be reorganized within your layers panel. So if it's way over here, you could leave it there, it doesn't matter, but I like to have it before the name. If you have that timeline icon visible, what this allows you to do is see multiple timelines at the same time, which is really helpful when it comes to matching multiple keyframes up on multiple layers. You can see them all at once. So this might be overboard, but I thought I'd show you anyway in case this is something you weren't familiar with. It's actually more helpful with animation than it is smart bones. Now that you'll learn how to create a smart bone properly, you probably won't use this for smart bones, but I'll show you anyway. So go ahead and click on the arm front layer. That's the one that we're currently on right now. So this is going to show me the timeline for the arm front. And now go ahead and click on the main bone timeline. And now I can see the timeline for the bone rotation, and I can see the timeline for the vector layer of that front arm for the points and the curvature keyframes. But now the question is, okay, so now how many frames do I move this? Well, let's start with 48, because I think I've had some pretty good success with 48 frames. So let's go ahead and let's move that to frame 48. And then with these bottom ones, we can actually space these out evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to left click and drag. I'm going to select those 3 keyframes. Well, there's 6 total, but they're on 3 frames. I'm going to hold down Alt. I'm going to left click on that last keyframe. It could be either one of these last 2 keyframes. And I'm going to left click and I'm going to drag to frame 48. So that's a keyboard shortcut that maybe you didn't know about, but that just lets you drag out your keyframes uniformly. So now we have our keyframe at frame 48, frame 24, and frame 0. So now I'm just going to scrub the timeline. I'm just going to left click and I'm just going to drag across the timeline. And I'm going to see if there's any other distortions in that smart bone between these frames. And it really doesn't look like there's any. So I think we fixed that. But I won't know until I go back to the main line, hit Z on my keyboard for the Manipulate Bones tool, and for some reason it's not working again. I'm going to go ahead and click on the tool itself, hold down Alt, left click, and I'm going to drag. And as you can see there, this is a result of not enough frames. It's not completely obvious, so if you want, you can give yourself more frames. As I rotate this, you can see that it's snapping. So I think the ideal amount of frames, if this doesn't work, is 100 frames. That's kind of the standard that I've seen within the Moho community that others use. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these keyframes, hold down Alt, left click, and drag out to frame 100. And I can't see this very well, so I'm going to go ahead and mark it on my timeline. This is going to create the start and stop of your animation, but we're not animating. I'm just going to use this as a marker. So we have it start at frame 1 and it's ending at frame 24 at the moment. I'm going to have it end at frame 100 so I could better see where that's at. Okay, so good. I have that lined up, frame 100. So now I should have enough frames for that smart bone. Again, smart bones don't need to be this complicated. They're really not once you get used to it. But I want to show you exactly what's happening, because a lot of the beginner errors that I see when I'm teaching or when I'm mentoring students is they get that stuttering effect when they move their arm bones and they don't know why. So it's just because you don't have enough frames for that animation. So let's go back to the main line, hit Z on the keyboard for the manipulate bones tool, and let's go ahead and let's rotate that, and it's not selecting again. Hit Z, and I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to rotate just that bone. And now you can see I have enough frames there that it creates a pretty smooth transition. Again, 100 frames might be a little overboard. For me, I've been pretty good with 48 frames, but if you want to use 100, that totally works. All right, now with that out of the way, I'm going to show you another example of the smart bone, but showing you the easy way, now that you know what not to do. All right, so we're going to create a smart bone for that same bone, because we know when I rotate that bone down, it still distorts. Just like it did up, we fixed that, but we still have the distortion going down. So how do you create a smart bone for the exact same bone going the other way? Well, we're going to do what we basically did before. We're going to make sure that we're on our main bone group layer. And then with that bone selected, I'm going to click on New Action. And this is going to create a new smart bone. Now you can see it's going to say B5 space 2, or if you labeled yours forearm, front forearm, it'll have a space and then a 2 after it. That lets me know that I have the naming the same as the previous smart bone, but that also I'm creating a separate action from the previous smart bone. So the smart bone in this case can only rotate. So we're only affecting the rotate and what happens to the artwork during that rotation. So in our case, we're just fixing the distortion with the transform points tool and the curvature tool. So now knowing what we know now, go ahead and place your end keyframe on frame 100, hit T on the keyboard for the transform bone tool, hold down Shift and rotate that down to the right. Alt left click on that layer, hit T on the keyboard for your transform points tool, drag out that point roughly to wherever it would need to be to match the existing volume if you still have your onion skins turned on. And again, like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just get it as close as you can. And I think that looks pretty good. And then you'll have your in-between keyframes that might not be exactly where you want them. So in this case, the in-between keyframe is going to be frame 50. And I'm just going to fix that just a little bit there. Give it a little bit more curvature. And that looks pretty good. So now if I go ahead and I scrub through, I'm just going to make sure that there's no obvious distortions. And that looks pretty good. See how easy a smart bone should be? Well, at least hopefully you now know why I explained all that I explained, so you can avoid those pitfalls. Now you can go back to the main line and you can test out that smart bone. Use your manipulate bones tool. Go ahead and rotate that and see how good it looks. You can see it gets a little bit thicker on the forearm for my smart bone, so I might need to make some adjustments for that. I'll show you an example for the leg, but I want you to do the other arm and the other leg yourself. So again, for the leg, we know that the distortion happens on the lower leg, not on the upper leg. So I'm going to select the lower leg bone, make sure I'm on the bone group layer. I'm going to go to the new action. I'm going to make sure that the B9 matches that layer. And it should auto match already after you just selected that bone. But that's just to make sure. B9, okay. I'm on my smart bone timeline. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move that bone, go to frame 100, and I'm going to move it. Alt right click on the layer to quick select that layer. I know I'm not working on the arm front layer anymore, so I'm going to change my visibility for the timeline to leg front. I'm going to go to the transform points tool and I'm going to adjust those points. Hit C on the keyboard, T on the keyboard, do some adjustments there, right there. And that looks pretty good, I think. I'm going to go back and I'm going to see where that knee is to make sure that that knee isn't going too high up there. It kind of looks like it is, so I'm just going to bring it back just a little bit. I'm going to round that out. And that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to go to the in-between frames. So I'm going to go to frame 50. And I can see that that's really thick, so I want to fix that. So I'm going to hit T on the keyboard and C on the keyboard, fix my curvature. That looks pretty good. I don't really want to create sharp angles. I kind of wanted to get a noodly effect on this, but let's see, something like that might work. Whoops, I accidentally hit my sequencer. I'm gonna go back to my channels. I'm gonna rotate that leg. That's one of the disadvantages of having too many keyframes. That's why I've kind of chosen 48 for mine. But if I have 100 frames, now I have 100 more possibilities that that's going to become distorted at some point, and it's just going to give me more frames to work with that I have to fix. So just keep that in mind too when it comes to how many frames you're picking to make that rotation a little bit smoother. Okay. And I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, there's a lot of frames there, so there's some in-betweening I can do to fix that. But overall, from far away, it's not that noticeable. I'm gonna go back to the main line. I'm gonna test that with the Manipulate Bones tool, just really quick. Make sure that that's working like it should. Cool, it is. Once I go past that point, you can see I have the distortion. Going back to the main bone group layer, I'm gonna select the new action window. It's gonna use that same smart bone name and then say space 2. I'm gonna hit OK. Go to frame 100. I'm gonna rotate that bone out. Alt right click to select that layer. I'm gonna hit the transform points tool. And I'm gonna adjust the curvature, adjust the transform points. So probably right about there. Go to frame 50. Fix the in-between area right about there. See if there's anything else that pops out. No, not really. Nothing that's too obvious there. I'm gonna go back to my main line and I should be good. So as far as these two parts here, yeah, we have smart bones on them. So go ahead and do the leg on the other side and the arm on the other side. Then once you're done with that, we're ready to move on to the next tutorial. So I haven't created the next tutorial at the time of this recording, but I think I might have an intermediate part 2 video. I wasn't really sure when I was planning this of how I wanted to split this up, but I did want to talk about target bones, and I still think that falls under intermediate, because for advanced, I want to leave it for body turns and things like that. So I think this is part 1 of the intermediate. Part 2 of the intermediate, we'll have the target bones. We'll clean up the rest of the rig, make sure it's ready to go for the advanced section. Woof. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully I explained this. I tried to explain this as best I can. Hopefully it's clear. It's about 10:30 at night at the time of this recording. But as always, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. If there's something that I need to clarify, I can create a video for that in the future to further clarify different points that weren't so clear in this tutorial. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like my videos in general and you're not a subscriber yet, please subscribe. And if you want to show any support for the channel, I do sell paid courses at my website there in the right corner, store.mccoybuck.com. That's all for now, and I'll see you in the next video.